All right, let's talk about what might be a pilot's most critical skill. And here's a hint. It has nothing to do with how they handle the controls. It's all about how they think, especially when things go wrong. We're going to dive into something called aeronautical decision-making. So here's what we've got on deck. We'll kick things off with the human factor in all this. Then we'll get into what aeronautical decision-making actually is. Look at the tools pilots use, some of the mental traps they have to watch out for, and wrap up with how they get better at it over time.
Okay, first things first, the high-stakes human factor. When you think about what makes a flight risky, what comes to mind? Probably engine failure, right? Or maybe a huge storm. Well, the data, it tells a surprisingly different story.
Take a look at this. When you break down the main causes of the most serious accidents, pilot error is responsible for a whopping 53%. That is more than double the rate of mechanical failure. So it's not the plane that's the biggest variable, it's the person flying it.
And if you zoom out to look at all aviation accidents, not just the fatal ones, that number gets even more eye-popping. Up to 80% can be traced back to some kind of human error. That's a huge number, and it's exactly why the entire aviation industry is so focused on improving how pilots make choices under pressure.
So that's the problem, right? So what's the solution? Well, it's something called aeronautical decision-making, and we're not just talking about gut feelings here. ADM is a formal, structured way of thinking that's designed to work when the stakes are highest. Here's the official definition from the FAA. You see that keyword right there? Systematic. That's the whole point. ADM is all about taking the guesswork and, frankly, the emotion out of making these critical choices. It gives pilots a reliable framework to fall back on. And to really understand how important this is, think of it this way. The industry sees piloting as having 3 core skills. You've got your stick and rudder skills, actually flying the plane. Then you've got your book smarts, knowing the systems, the rules. And right there with them, just as important, is aeronautical decision-making. It's the cognitive part of the job, and it is absolutely non-negotiable.
Okay, so that all sounds good in theory, but how does it actually work in the cockpit? Well, pilots have a mental toolkit they can use, and one of the cornerstone models is called the 3P model.
The 3P model is basically a simple loop that just runs continuously in a pilot's mind. It's perceive, process, perform. So first, you see what's going on. Then, you figure out what it means for you. And finally, you do something about it. Let's dig into each of these steps. All right, step 1, perceive. And this is way more than just, looking out the window. It's about actively scanning for any and all potential hazards. And to make sure nothing gets missed, they use a really useful acronym called PAVE. PAVE really forces them to do a full 360-degree check. So P is for pilot, am I good to go? A is for aircraft, is this plane ready for this flight? V is for environment, what's the weather doing? What about the airspace? And then there's E for external pressures. This one is so important. It's about asking, is someone or something pushing me to make a bad call here?
And that pilot part of PAVE? It gets its own even deeper checklist. It's called I'M SAFE, and before every single flight, a pilot has to ask themselves about illness, medication, stress, alcohol, fatigue, and emotion. It's basically a requirement to be brutally honest with yourself about whether you're actually fit to fly.
Okay, so you've used PAVE to spot the hazards. Now what? Well, you move on to step 2, process. This is all about figuring out what those hazards actually mean. You have to analyze the risk. And to do that, there's another great checklist, care.
With care, you're asking a few key questions. What are the consequences of this hazard? What alternatives do I have? Am I facing the reality of this situation, or am I kidding myself? And you check in again on those external pressures. It's how you turn a list of potential problems into a real understanding of the situation.
Okay, so we've perceived with PAVE, and we've processed with care. Now it's time to actually do something. That's the third step, perform. This is where a decision gets made, and the tool for that is the team checklist.
Team gives the pilot a menu of options for dealing with a risk. Can you transfer it? Like, can you ask air traffic control for help? Can you eliminate it entirely, maybe by just not flying into that storm? Do you have to accept it, and if so, are you prepared for it? Or can you mitigate it? Reduce its impact, like changing altitude to find smoother air.
So, having all these checklists and models is great, but there's another side to this, the pilot's own mind. You have to be aware of the internal biases that can trip you up. The FAA has actually identified 5 specific hazardous attitudes that pilots are trained to spot in themselves.
And here they are. You've got anti-authority, which is that little voice that says, the rules don't apply to me. Impulsivity is that urge to just do something now. Then there's invulnerability. That'll never happen to me. The macho attitude. I got this. Watch me. And finally, resignation, which is basically just giving up and thinking, what's the use? The key is learning to hear these thoughts and immediately shut them down.
Which brings us to our last big topic. How do pilots actually get good at this? Because here's the thing. Good judgment isn't something people are born with. It's a skill. It's built, it's practiced, and it's reinforced over and over again. So how do they do it? Well, it's a whole system. You've got standard operating procedures, so you don't have to invent a solution in a crisis. There's obsessive pre-flight planning, where you can think clearly on the ground. There's specific training for managing resources and spotting threats. And, maybe the coolest part, there's incredibly realistic simulation training. Pilots can face these life-or-death scenarios over and over again in a place where it's 100% safe to make a mistake.
You know, at the end of the day, all of this training isn't about trying to create a perfect pilot who never makes a mistake, because that's just not possible for any human being. The real goal is to build a safety net, a system of mental habits and procedures that's strong enough to catch those inevitable human errors before they turn into something much worse.
And even though all of this was designed for pilots, these ideas are useful for pretty much everyone. I mean, it really makes you think, doesn't it? Where else in our lives, maybe at work or even in our personal decisions, could a simple process like perceive, process, perform help us avoid a big mistake?